Welcome to Inflation. Policymakers should stop driving it and start fighting it. Please welcome our host, Darren Bass, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation.
Good afternoon. As was stated, my name is Darren Bax, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. I want to thank you for joining us today as we discuss a critical issue that affects all of us, inflation. Inflation is soaring at rates that we haven't seen in a generation. In the last 12-month period, inflation rose 7%. That's the largest 12-month increase in 40 years. And I'm pleased to be joined by some of my Heritage colleagues. Katie Tubb, who's to the far left of me. She's a senior policy analyst here and an energy expert. And Rachel Resler is right next to me, is a research fellow and covers numerous issues, including labor policy. And joining us from New Hampshire is my colleague and research fellow in economic policy, Peter St. Onge. He'll be co-hosting the program today. And in addition to our discussion that we're going to have today on inflation, we want to hear from you. So please do submit your questions throughout the program. We're going to be monitoring them, and we're going to have time near the end of the program to answer your questions. So let's get right to it. Peter, it's really nice to see you. I hope everything's going well, New Hampshire.
Thank you. It's a bit cold, but yes.
It's cold here too. Could you provide us a quick big picture overview of what's going on with inflation?
Definitely. Thank you, Darren. So in the abstract, what drives inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Then you can have sort of an assist from stuck supply chains, from rising government burdens, things like regulations, taxes, and mandates. And those can either add directly to the price of a good, or they can distort markets, which can either raise costs or it can lower supply. Now, the too much money part is largely about federal spending. So we're talking about 6 to 7 trillion since COVID. This is aided and abetted by a historically easy money policy at the Federal Reserve. But the too few goods part, that is largely a policy question. And there's really a lot of work that the federal government can do there. So in this paper, which is upcoming, we focused on a lot of these policy reforms on things driving inflation, specifically in housing, labor costs, food, energy, international trade, and energy. These are areas that collectively make up almost our entire economy. And of course, they impact consumers as well as impacting American factories. So taken together, these policies are causing high prices. They're also disrupting supply chains, leading to shortages or empty shelves, as it's trending on Twitter. And they can even strangle entire industries in the crib, right? Which we're currently seeing a sort of slow motion destruction of our domestic energy industry, or with independent contractors, so-called gig workers. That is a popular career choice among younger workers. These are all at risk because of these policies going forward.
Thanks, Peter. It's a great overview. And we're going to be talking a lot about government intervention today and a lot about regulation. But I want to talk real quickly about spending. Can you just let us know how spending actually has an impact on inflation?
Right. So if the fundamental problem is too much money chasing too few goods, then pouring trillions into the economy sort of creates this wall of demand that runs up against existing supply. Now, if you pair that with a supply chain that's crippled at the moment, partly by COVID and then partly by a series of bad policy choices, you end up sort of getting a double whammy where all of that new money is flowing in, it's pumping up customer demand, and supply is unable to respond to it. When you have that kind of a situation, you can get shortages. One of the most dramatic examples we're seeing, if anybody is trying to buy a car right now, it's quite difficult. We've got inflation in new cars in double digits year on year. In used cars, they're closer to 37%. Probably most of you are driving cars that are worth more than when you bought them. This is not a natural state of affairs. So additional spending is driving a lot of this. The Biden administration has a lot of activist mouths to feed. So they keep coming up with new ways to pour yet more trillions onto the fire.
So I want to turn it over to you, Rachel, real quick. So the one problem I constantly hear from employers is there's a shortage of employees and labor costs. So let's start with labor costs. What's going on there?
Yeah, so we've heard about rising labor costs. I think anybody who has talked to a small business owner out there knows that there are complaints about having to increase the wages and the compensation that they're paying these workers. And so we have, over the past year, we've seen about a 4.7% increase in the median hourly wage. That's 2 times the average over the past 10 years before that. So that's already a big increase. But then you add on to that all the benefits that they've had to add. We're talking about massive increase in paid family leave. And now that actually isn't optional. A lot of these benefits are all optional, responding to workers' demands. But paid family leave, tuition assistance, pet insurance, there's just all these new things that are there. Also increased costs for health insurance, and workers' compensation packages are significantly higher. I will note, though, that I talked about that 4.7% increase in hourly wages over the past year, but that's nominal. When you take into account that over 7% inflation, workers' wages in purchasing power terms are actually down by 2.4%. So what is contributing to these rising costs? And it's part of a cycle too, one feeds into the other. But I think one thing we can definitely pinpoint here is that policymakers at the start of the pandemic instituted these $600 bonus unemployment insurance benefits that were readily available. That resulted in 2/3 of unemployed workers actually making more by not working than if they accepted a job or found a new one. And so that had a significant implication for what employers had to pay workers, particularly at the lower end. So the Federal Reserve measures something called a worker's reservation wage. And if you look at the reservation wages of workers who make less than $60,000 a year, that wage went from about $40,000 in March of 2020 to almost $51,000 in March of 2021. It just surged over 26%. Some of that has dissipated since then because we don't have those bonus benefits still around, but there are a number of other policies that are still at play. And then another factor that's really contributing to employers' costs is record high quits rates. Over the past 4 months, 4.3 million workers have quit their jobs on average every month. So if you're an employer, that means that over the course of the year, you should expect to have to replace 1 out of every 3 of your workers. Replacing workers is extremely costly. It, on average, takes about 6 to 9 months worth of a worker's salary to have the cost of finding a new worker and training them. So if you look at the quits this year compared to last year, employers have had to replace about 10 million additional workers. When you do the math, that increased their costs by about 3 to 4%, and there's no new value added to that. It's just a higher cost. So of course they're having to pass that on to customers.
So Reggie, you kind of got to this a little bit, but can you tell us more about the employee shortage problem?
Yeah, and so that's the big thing here, is that there's this huge shortage of willing workers. I estimate that we have about 5 million fewer workers than we would have had if we'd simply continued on trend since prior to the pandemic. And when you couple that with the increased demand that Peter was talking about, over $6 trillion in spending, and this double whammy, we have a record high number of job openings out there right now, 10.6 million. To put that in perspective, prior to the pandemic, when we had an incredibly strong labor market, the record was 7.8 million job openings in November of 2018. So there's a ton of job openings out there. The unemployment rate is actually doing quite well, but it's 3.9% because so many people have dropped out of the labor force. We now have 1.5 jobs available for every unemployed worker. And so businesses are reporting that labor is their biggest problem. 49% of businesses, according to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, 49% said that they were unable to fill open positions in November. The shortage has contributed to, of course, if you can't fill those positions, you increase your compensation. 48% of businesses increased their compensation in December, and another 32% said they plan to increase it over the coming 3 months. And so now we just get in this cycle here, and with employers being desperate for workers, they're having to raise wages, but it's not that the wages are coming from the workers producing more, and so that's why we see it feeding into the prices.
And Rachel, so how does this impact inflation specifically? Like, how does this feed through to what people pay?
Yeah, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that about 60% of the costs of all of the things that we consume and the services that we purchase are from labor itself. And so if you have this massive shortage out there, that's absolutely feeding through to higher prices. If you have a grocery store that now has to increase wages by 20% just to get the worker to do the exact same job that they were asking them to do a year ago, you have to raise your prices. If you have a hospital that has to lay off dozens of workers because of a vaccine mandate, and you have to contract in people at a 50% increase for those doctors and nurses, you have to increase your costs. And yes, that's originally the insurance company that's probably footing the bill, but eventually that translates into higher costs for us as well. And if you have all these quits happening, you have to take into that's just added cost that comes with no new value. You know, it's a great thing when wages rise because of adding value, but when there's nothing new produced, it's just higher costs.
Rachel, I do want to ask you something on the side here. You had recently written about the Build Back Better proposal, that could make this worse?
Absolutely. There's a lot of things in there that would be keeping kind of the welfare without work policies that were put in place supposedly temporarily during COVID, but making them permanent. There are ways that it would discourage people from participating in the labor market. There are ways it would push workers into unions and restrict their ability to work. You know, taken on net here, there have been some various estimates that peg the job losses coming out of the Build Back Better Act at anywhere between 5 million to 9 million. And if you're an employer out there and you see there's already 10.6 million job openings and potentially 5 to 9 more million people would drop out of the labor force, that's an even bigger problem.
Wow, those are really big numbers. Thank you for that. We're going to move over into another huge area that's driving inflation, which is energy. So, Katie, while labor costs do get a lot of attention, they obviously impact people. Energy does as well. Energy is an input to nearly every facet of life. Almost every good and service we buy has energy in it. So can you tell us what's happening in energy, what kinds of trends we've been seeing recently?
Yeah, and Peter, I think you're right to emphasize how important energy is to just our basic well-being. You know, I think in America we're fortunate to take it for granted, but that's becoming harder and harder to take for granted now and ignore. So I think it's interesting to look at where we had been back in 2019. So energy production for the first time since 1957 exceeded consumption. Average energy costs were down 5% for Americans, and per capita energy costs were down in every single state except the state of California, which is a rich territory for discussion right there as to why that was. So with that as kind of our baseline of where we had been going, 2020 was a huge shift, and as we've seen, energy prices have increased across the board, and we're looking at basically historic energy prices for the better part of almost a decade at this point, or in comparison to about a decade at this point. I want to look at coal, oil, and natural gas because that's where Americans get 80% of our energy needs met and 91% of our transportation needs. So natural gas, come November 2021, we were seeing the highest prices since the winter of 2014. With crude oil, after the market bottomed out in April 2020, prices increased 125% to November 2021. Natural gas, or excuse me, gasoline prices, national average gasoline prices, have been the highest they've been since 2014, and they haven't fallen below $3 since the month of May. And coal is an interesting situation in that it's both production, consumption, and prices have decreased over the years until recently, and in all three categories, coal has increased. So the Energy Information Administration puts out a winter fuels outlook every year, and I think it helps show some of the implications of these trends for American families and households. And what they did is looked at energy costs for households based on where they get their primary heating source. So households that are primarily heated by electricity can expect to see their energy costs this year go up 6%. Households that are heated by natural gas are looking at a 30% increase in their energy costs. Heating oil up 43%, and propane 54%. And I think it's important to qualify that a little bit because there are regional differences based on how states regulate their own energy markets, and there are, again, implications for policy there. And of course, that was an October estimate, and both November and December were a little bit milder than we were expecting. But I think what we can come away with here is that regardless of the exact increase, the magnitude is the same. It is up. And that's what Americans have been dealing with for the better part of 2021.
So, Katie, what's driving these energy trends?
Yeah, I mentioned California, but I think there's a whole variety of reasons that we could talk about this for the next hour. But I want to kind of highlight a few things. First, the pandemic, of course, and policy responses to the pandemic absolutely had an impact on energy markets. Just to give you an example of the magnitude of that impact, in 2020, energy consumption was down 7%. That is the largest annual decrease since at least 1949. So we're talking about huge implications in energy markets. On the production side, crude oil, I think, is a good example. That was down 8% in 2020. So that's a lot to come back from and correct for and to get back online. And certainly an uneven recovery, again, because of policy implications, has been a major source of uncertainty in energy markets. But I think it would be a huge mistake to stop there and just say this is the pandemic and this is economic recovery, because I think we're seeing the implications of bad policy in energy markets that have really injected rigidity into energy markets, both on the production side and the consuming side. And I think that's where the more interesting policy conversation is, frankly, because we're dealing with legacy policies that have gone uncorrected for, in some cases, centuries, the Jones Act being a very good example of that. But we're also looking at a Biden administration and the administration's allies in Congress that are pursuing policies more akin to Europe, I think, that have profound implications for energy markets and uncertainty there. The administration has used basically every regulatory tool in the toolbox to attack coal, oil, and natural gas, whether you're talking about the financing side of this, the production, or the consumption side of it. And so if you're in those industries, I don't know why you would want to spend millions of dollars investing in workers and infrastructure when this administration has said you have no future in this country. And so I think that's some of what we're dealing with here, is both the legacy policy inhibitions we've created over just years and years of, I think, poor policy decision making, but also a very uncertain future under this administration.
That is all very interesting and very concerning. Looking forward to European levels of energy prices. I don't think Americans would welcome that. Darren, now it's your turn. We're going to turn to food, something near and dear to many people. Can you tell us what's happening with food prices?
Yeah. I think when it comes to inflation, there's probably no area when it comes to prices that is more visible to Americans than food prices, because we go to the grocery store and we see the higher prices. I was just at the grocery store a couple times last week, and not a lot of food actually there, unfortunately, and also higher prices. So it's concerning. In December, last month, the food prices were, I think, an incredible 6.3% higher than last year. To kind of provide some perspective, the last time food prices had a 12-month increase of 6.3% or more was over 13 years ago. Now, it's true that monthly food prices can fluctuate a lot, but what we're seeing is really concerning, Peter, because we're starting to see a trend over the last several months. Initially, it was like a couple months we were concerned. Then it was, okay, the third month, right? Now it's getting disconcerting. Now you got 4 months in a row of really, really high year-over-year food prices. So to give some context, the usual annual rate of increase you'd see in food prices is about 2.5%. So in September, food prices were up 4.6%, a lot more than that 2.5 or so. October was 5.3%, November 6.1%, and December, as I said, was 6.3%. That is 4 months of really unusually high year-over-year increases in food prices. So that is disconcerting. And if we look at annual calendar year data, it's also disconcerting. So the USDA, whose latest forecast does not include the December data, because they just haven't incorporated it yet because it just came out, they have projected the food prices for 2021 to be 3 to 4%. So let's just be conservative and say for 2021 prices, the increase for 2021 would be 3.5%. Over the last 20 years, that 3.5% or higher, we've only reached that number 3 times. So food prices are really unusually high. And finally, the one thing I really do want to stress is that we're seeing higher food prices across all food categories. It's not just one little area of food, it's across the food categories.
Interesting. So what do you think is driving this? Food prices go up and down, but why is this happening across the board?
I really think that the best place to start is actually to look to my colleagues here, Rachel and Katie. I think they talked about labor and energy impacting the food sector, and that's they didn't say the food sector, but everything, labor and energy, is so critical across the entire economy. Guess what? Food sector is a big part of that economy, and it impacts the food sector. So labor shortages are hurting the food industry big time. Restaurants, fast food industries. I go to a shopping center, and Domino's has got this advertisement of trying to offer these big bonuses for people to kind of be delivery people. I'm like, oh, maybe that's something I could do on the side. So there's definitely.
I talked to a milk farmer in upstate New York, and he was telling me their biggest problem is labor. He's offering people $22 an hour, no experience, come in, and he can't get them to come in. And at that time, when the benefits were still in place, they were actually telling him, sorry, but until these bonuses run out, it's more beneficial for me to stay at home.
Yep.
That's the type of kind of the thing that's going on. It's really difficult for the people on the across the food supply. So you got it from the upstream, downstream of the food supply chain. And Katie was talking about what I consider to be a war on conventional fuels. And that's obviously going to hurt everybody, again, across the food supply chain. Look, if you drive up energy and labor costs for businesses, at some point we can't be shocked when those businesses decide to pass on those costs to customers. And that's what we're seeing. Now, there are some food-specific issues, and let me just give you 2 really quick examples. First, there are some new countervailing duties on fertilizer, and countervailing duties are just taxes on imports. And it's basically a fertilizer tax, and as you might imagine, farmers are not particularly thrilled about this, and they shouldn't be, because fertilizer is a key input into farming. This is a costly burden on farmers. My second example is something that, for people who know me, know that I talk about probably too much. That's an issue called waters in the United States. It's basically the term waters in the United States is a terminology that defines what waters the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers can regulate under the Clean Water Act. It has been an ongoing issue, and it's really important to know what waters, in fact, the government can regulate, because if it's a very broad and vague definition, then farmers are really in a position where they're not sure what can they engage in certain activities or not. And what happened was, during the Trump administration, they came up with a new rule that provides some clarity, and it provided a more narrow definition of what waters the federal government can regulate. Well, of course, the Biden administration rejected the Trump rule and is going to be pushing this kind of big federal overreach. And something that was just announced, and Katie, I think you probably saw this, is that the Biden administration has said that they're not going to honor, if the Corps and the federal government have decided, we're going to tell you that those waters that you have on your property are not regulated, and that was based on the Trump rule, Biden administration is saying, guess what? We're not going to comply with what we said months ago. So forget what we said. You're out of luck. So it's already difficult and for property owners and farmers because of all kinds of unpredictability. Now you create a scenario where it's so unpredictable that even when you actually have some predictability, oh, I know that this water's not regulated, then the government comes back a year later to say, oh, it is regulated, too bad, so sad. So you're not going to plan, you're going to be scared, you're not going to engage in certain activities, you're probably just not going to be as productive. So that's the WOTUS issue, the Waters of the United States, so I'm going to call it WOTUS. I'll probably bring it up as WOTUS again later. Look, if you want to drive up food prices, you impose massive regulations. Biden administration is doing that. You create unpredictability, you create uncertainty, you're going to drive up food prices. The Biden administration is doing that, and that's what we're seeing.
Now, I do want to ask you, the Biden administration has been going after meat packers. Senator Warren has been going after big grocery. Is this corporate profiteering?
Never heard big grocery, but
grocers' margins on average are about 1% per year. So.
Yeah, it's funny how everything is big something. I've heard big chicken. I'm sure there's just every big. Look, I'm going to talk about the meat issue because we do hear that a lot, too much. First, I think it's really important to understand that the food price issue is across the board. It's not like some meat issue. It's across all kinds of food categories, as I said at the start. So fresh fruits, for example, are going up way, significantly in price. And the last time I checked, we don't slaughter citrus. Maybe as far as I know. Second, annual beef and veal prices actually declined twice over the last 6 years. So I would say, would the Biden administration blame concentration for that? So they probably would say, okay, it's price gouging because prices are going up, the beef and veal. Are they going to call that predatory pricing, the beef and veal? Third, the USDA itself doesn't even argue that concentration is causing higher prices when it comes to meat. Now I wrote a piece with a colleague about a year ago saying that, and at the time, the USDA didn't even mention competition or concentration issues at all regarding meat prices. And I just was on the USDA website, and they've updated it, and they have the page now says, quote, concentration and capacity constraints within the meat industry could also affect prices. So I guess the USDA got the administration memo. And you know what? Here's the thing. I agree that concentration and capacity could also affect prices. It could, and many things could affect prices. Fourth, the argument in many ways makes no sense. I'm going to take beef as an example. How can current beef prices be attributable to a lack of competition due to high concentration levels, which the Biden administration alleges, when for the past 25 years or more, the concentration levels have been relatively the same the whole time? So they can't be, unless you actually believe that the alleged concentration problem has just decided to kick in after 25 years. And finally, and the most glaring omission from the administration's meat attack, and that's what it is, it's an attack on the meat industry, just like it's an attack on the conventional fuels, we're seeing an attack on the food system, the meat industry, is a failure to recognize how the federal government itself might have contributed to the concentration problem in meat processing. The existing federal meat inspection system creates all kinds of high costs for meat processing facilities and imposes high costs on state inspected facilities. And, so if you're a state inspected facility, you're thought of, but the USDA deems you to be equivalent in terms of safety and everything as a federal inspected facilities. But as a state inspected facility, you are prohibited by federal law from selling the meat across state lines. You can only sell it within the state. Look, the only meat processors and facilities that can meet the high costs are the largest facilities. Federal law contributed a big part to what's going on with any type of concentration. And for the Biden administration to not acknowledge that to me I think, says a lot. And fortunately, some legislators out there are trying to address this kind of skewed kind of monopoly, one-size-fits-all federal meat inspection system and try to create some more flexibility within the system so that state inspected facilities and farmers can more easily sell their meat to people all over the country. And actually, now I'm going to ask you a question, Peter, before you ask me another one.
I'm on the hot seat. Okay.
Yes. One thing we haven't got into yet is housing prices. And housing is a really important area, and we talked a lot about it in the paper. So can you tell us about housing prices?
Yeah, housing is a big deal. It makes up about 1/3 of the consumer price index. In other words, about 1/3 of every dollar Americans spend goes into housing. They are currently rising at historic rates, like many other things. In fact, housing is going up far faster now, these are house prices, than in the 2008 financial crisis, which was caused by housing. So this, of course, is driving inflation, being 1/3 of the CPI. In fact, there's concern that current consumer price inflation might be understated because of how housing is counted. The main input into housing costs is the price of a house, right? So you would expect that those costs would track housing prices pretty closely. In fact, year on year, we're looking at house prices are up 20%, as according to the Federal Reserve. Yet the housing component of CPI is up 4%. So something's wrong there. And of course, this is about how the statistics are collected. We've changed the methodology since the 1970s in how we count the housing contribution to inflation. Rents are counted according to the rents this month. All of aggregate rents. So, some of these contracts may be months or years old. They're reflecting old prices. There's a bunch of sort of shenanigans that happen inside the statistics. But the point is, housing is rising extremely fast. Indeed, 20% annual rise is significantly higher than generalized inflation. So what's driving this? Partly that money creation that we talked about on the top of it. Generally the way that our central banking system creates money is to subsidize interest rates to make them lower than the market would have made them. This effectively, currently it's actually paying you to get a mortgage, right? So mortgage rates are around 3% at the moment. Inflation, as Rachel mentioned, is running at 7%. So that means you're being paid 4% a year to buy a house. Okay, you're buying. This is extremely low in historic terms, and of course people react, right? If you're being paid 4% to buy an asset, you buy it. You should buy it. Beyond these, there's we've had decades of just government-wide efforts to try to promote home ownership. Your taxes are subsidized. You get a capital gains break on housing profits. And really, the sort of mechanism of a lot of this subsidization has been two government-sponsored entities called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. All right, and the purpose of these two organizations, which buy up, I believe at the moment, the majority of mortgages in the U.S., the purpose of them is to subsidize home purchase. And perhaps the original intent was that if people buy houses, they're more attached to the community, these sorts of things. But the thing is, Fannie and Freddie, a lot of the money, it either goes into subsidizing second homes, which it doesn't seem like we should necessarily be using government to subsidize vacation homes, which of course are disproportionately owned by rich people, or they're going into so-called jumbo loans, which are these loans above a certain threshold, typically something like $600,000 or $700,000. And those, again, typically go to higher income people. So whatever the merits of promoting home ownership in general, it seems like those have lost their mission over time and are really going into essentially handing money to rich people. Now, beyond these subsidies, you've got really, again, at both the federal and even state and local level, you've got this sort of whole of government approach that ends up boosting house prices. So, for example, you have restrictive zoning, where you can only build certain types of housing in particular neighborhoods. Now, there are many cities in the world that use almost no zoning whatsoever, such as Houston, for one. Tokyo is another nice example, right? You've got 10 tons of people crammed into a very small space, almost no zoning. You might have a factory or workshop right next to a school. This is not allowed in our country, for the most part. So anyway, restrictive zoning can end up either distorting development, effectively taking land out of the supply. It can even close off entire districts. Sometimes that's environmental. They might protect a particular zone in order to keep people from moving there. The Everglades is a nice example of that. If you look at, Seattle, San Francisco, some of the cities with the highest house prices, if you look at it from Google Maps, a huge part of those cities is unbuilt. It could be built, right? You have hills in San Francisco. Hong Kong manages to build on hills. In fact, the original city of San Francisco was largely built on hills, but a lot of those have been taken out. And partly that is to drive up housing costs. Partly it's to keep land expensive so that poor people don't move in. And Peter, then finally we had.
Okay,
yeah, sorry. I was just going to say. Oh, sorry. Was I dropping out?
No.
Sorry about
finish
that.
It off. Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, I was going to say, just in the past 2 years since COVID, we've really had a big hit to housing costs, which is the eviction moratoria, right? These rules that forbid landlords from kicking out tenants for not paying. And those are having an enormous impact on rents, right? Because they raise the risks to landlords, right? In the old days, you didn't think you had to set aside money to cover the possibility that everybody would stop paying rent at once. Now you have to cover that. And so, across the board, all of these housing subsidies, the privileges, the distortions, these all end up raising costs to Americans, but particularly to lower income, working families, young families who are trying to buy a house in the first place.
That's a great summary, Peter. We're going to have to go into a bonus round because I realize how late it is, and we really do talk way too much, I think, apparently. So let's just get straight to the solutions. And if we, again, do a bonus round here, because we want to get to questions from the audience. So Rachel, what are some solutions here on the labor side of things?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I mean, on labor, if we want to have more people participating in the labor market, it's really twofold. It has to pay to work, for people to be willing to work, and it also can't pay to not work. And so addressing that latter point, not paying to not work, we need to get rid of the existing welfare without work policies that are out there, and we need to not enact new ones through the Build Back Better Act that would make it so that even more people drop out of the labor force. Just one example is some economists have estimated that making the child payments permanent would cause 2.6% of parents to drop out of the labor force. That's 1.5 million. And it may seem like there would be some benefit to these payments going to families, but in reality, those same economists found that it would have zero impact on deep childhood poverty. So this is simply pushing people out of work and not actually lifting those poorest children up. And then in order to get people into the labor force, it has to pay to work. There are so many things that can be done on that level. But absolutely, when we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you saw that employers used that money. There were tax cuts for individuals and also for businesses. They pushed that back to their employees, and they did it not only through wage increases, but also through investment that make workers more productive. And then you actually get more value out of the worker instead of just a price increase along with it. Workers had their wages go up by $1,400 compared to the previous trends after those tax cuts were passed. There need to be options for people to work. There have to be doors that are open, and a lot of that comes to independent work. 1 out of 3 Americans performed independent work last year. That's gig work, freelancing, contracting, whatever you want to call it. And 9 out of 10 people say the future is bright for that. But this current administration and a lot of liberal lawmakers want to essentially eliminate those opportunities for people where it's actually just opening doors, providing higher income on average. And then don't impose vaccine mandates. You're needlessly preventing people from working. And one thing that could be done in the short term that would actually help reduce taxpayers' costs related to labor is ending the Davis-Bacon law. This is a Jim Crow relic that essentially just drives up the construction costs by using a not market-based wage, rather an exclusive union wage, and so construction costs end up being 10% higher on average.
Thanks, Rachel. Katie, what can we do in energy?
Sure. Really quick, I think it's simple but not easy, in that the simple answer is to do a total about face on government-centric policies to manage energy markets, and instead move towards customer choice and free competition, open competition in the energy sector, to allow innovation to move with the direction of customer demand, and also to reduce barriers to the flow of energy between suppliers and their customers. That has implications across policy sectors. For example, we could get rid of all energy subsidies in the tax code and move towards broadly available pro-growth tax policies. I think states need to up their game here. State renewable portfolio standards and electricity mandates actually inhibit energy suppliers from switching to fuels that are more affordable. And I think, frankly, they're just irresponsible political slogans that have nothing to do with grid reliability or energy prices. So again, moving towards actual competition and being committed to competition. I think we need to get rid of these legacy policies like the federal ethanol mandate. There we go. And policies that discourage